Morning, everybody. My name is Robin Wright. I am a distinguished scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, also a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I'm a columnist at The New Yorker. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this very, very timely event that will explore the global impact of the events of 9/11, a moment in American history that has defined our nation throughout the 21st century. The events of 9/11 need no introduction. The four planes that flew into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and into a lonely field in Pennsylvania changed the world, changed our national security perspective, where and how we fought wars, our internal security, our sense of identity. It affected our economic life, and it probably will for the foreseeable future. The impact is far from over. So I am delighted to have an extraordinary panel this morning to discuss where we stand 20 years after, and then later to look at the future of terrorism, of radicalization and what the West does about it, about South Asia, and the impact in the Middle East. Joining us this morning are four wonderful scholars. First off will be Bruce Hoffman, who is America's foremost scholar on terrorism. He was appointed by the US Congress to be a member of the 9/11 Review Commission. He was a scholar in residence on counterterrorism at the CIA, an advisor to the multinational forces and the coalition provisional government in Iraq. He is now a Wilson Center Global Fellow, a Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a Senior Fellow at West Point's U.S. Military Academy, and a professor at Georgetown University. He's the author of several books, including Anonymous Soldiers and The Evolution of Global Terrorism. Next up will be Michael Kugelman, who is an expert on South Asia and that triple whammy of issues: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. He is currently the Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Asia program. Michael is also the author of the South Asia Brief, a weekly newsletter for Foreign Policy magazine. He's also published several works on South Asia, including Pakistan's interminable energy crisis and India's contemporary security challenges. Fernando Reinares is one of Europe's foremost experts on radicalization. He is the director of the program on radicalization and global terrorism at the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid. He was the first president of the expert group on violent radicalization for the European Commission and an advisor for counterterrorism policy at Spain's Ministry of the Interior. He is currently a professor of political science and security studies at King Juan Carlos University and an advisor to the Global Center on Cooperative Security in New York. We're honored to have him at the Wilson Center as a global fellow, and he's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He's a contributing editor to the Journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. And last but not least is Nadia Owedat, who is an expert on the Middle East. She was formerly at the RAND Corporation. Now she is a senior fellow on the Middle East program with both the Wilson Center and New America. She is the author of two books: A Million Clicks to Freedom, the virtual battle of ideas in the Arab-speaking world, and secondly, Reform and its Perils in Contemporary Islam, very topical subjects. She is a columnist for Middle East Broadcasting Network and as well an assistant professor of history and security studies at Kansas State University. So today's format will be, I'll ask two rounds of questions of each, one again looking at today's issues, where we stand, and then a second round looking on the future. And then we welcome your questions. If you want to get in line for questions, you can submit a question to anyone on the panel or more, first by sending an email to MEP for Middle East Program, MEP at wilsoncenter.org, or secondly, by tagging at Wilson Center MEP on Twitter. And that will then forward the questions to me to relay to our panel. So let's start with Bruce. How has the threat from terrorism, specifically from the kind of jihadi militancy witnessed on 9/11, evolved over the past 2 decades? How is it different today and 20 years later? In what ways? Over to you.
Well, first, Robin, thank you for moderating this. You introduced all of us, but I think everyone attending this should know that you're one of the foremost analysts of terrorism as well. And your book, Sacred Rage, is still required reading in my classes. And that book was published, I think, 30 years ago. So it's a pleasure to have you moderating this. Well, if what Henry Kissinger once observed is true, that the insurgent or the terrorist, for that matter, wins by not losing. For instance, there are now 4 times as many terrorists, both al-Qaeda to. There are 4 times as many Salafi jihadi terrorist groups designated by the US State Department today than there were 20 years ago. Adverse less in one place, Afghanistan, both al-Qaeda around the globe, and 24 France or Brad, the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia. Similarly, 20 years ago, there was just Al-Qaeda. Now there's ISIS. ISIS has its own branches or franchises or vilayets as it network. So we that incontestably we've weakened serially, militarily. The problem is the ideology that underpins this movement continues to have tremendous resonance. And one has to say, too, with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, has received an enormous boost to its narrative that I fear will attract new recruits and new supporters after all the progress we've made against Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Great. Thank you very much. Michael, let's turn to you. How did 9/11, especially the war in Afghanistan, impact or change South Asia? How is the region different today?
Yeah, well, thanks, Robin. And I'll be very blunt. The U.S. policies that resulted from 9/11 had destabilizing effects in South Asia, and they deleteriously impacted U.S. interests too. This is not to say that there was not any instability in the region before 9/11. Of course there was. Afghanistan had been at war since 1979. Pakistan had suffered from sectarian-rooted militancy as far back as the 80s. And also, this is not to say that U.S. policies did not produce any stability in the region. They did. Top terrorist leaders were arrested and eliminated. The al-Qaeda threat was degraded in a big way in Afghanistan. And the removal of the Taliban allowed for the growth of civil society and strengthened personal freedoms to an extent in Afghanistan. But I think it's undeniable that the U.S. response to 9/11, essentially the decision to go to war in Afghanistan, ushered in more instability in the region, even if indirectly. And I say this for several reasons, very briefly. First, the war in Afghanistan resulted in tens of thousands killed. And yet these deaths and a prolonged war could have been avoided. Early on in the war, after the US achieved its initial goals of eliminating al-Qaeda sanctuaries and removing the Taliban regime from power, there was an opportunity to end the war. The Taliban proposed reconciliation talks soon after it was knocked out of power, but the US government chose to keep fighting. And this led to an incredibly tragic balance sheet, resulting in the deaths of about 114,000 Afghans, according to the Watson Institute at Brown. And make no mistake, the great majority were killed by the Taliban and its allies, but only because of the war that the US chose to keep fighting, even when it had a chance to end it. Second, the war in Afghanistan led to the emergence of new terror groups that did not exist pre-9/11. We heard about ISIS in the global context, but in the South Asia context, the Pakistani Taliban between 2007 and 2014 was one of the most potent and deadly terror groups in South Asia, dozens of attacks in Pakistan and some in Afghanistan. The Pakistani Taliban was formed in 2007, and it emerged from a loose movement of Pashtun tribes that opposed the US war in Afghanistan. Additionally, a milestone moment in the modern history of South Asian militancy came in 2007 when the Pakistani military stormed a mosque in Islamabad that had been besieged by radicals. That assault triggered waves of retaliatory attacks that continued for a number of years. And what's often forgotten is that that mosque was a hotbed of radicalism whose preachers focused much of their ire on the US military presence in Afghanistan and the Pakistani government's perceived support for it. Third, US post 9/11 policies caused anti-Americanism to increase in a big way in the region. Pakistan was the epicenter of the drone war for many years. This was quite unpopular in Pakistan, but I'd argue that the US move with the most damaging impact on US public diplomacy in South Asia in the post 9/11 era was the very move that many Americans see as the crowning US achievement in South Asia over the last 20 years, and that is the elimination of Osama bin Laden. This was, I think, one of many US actions in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region after 9/11 that was clearly a tactical triumph, but at the same time had troubling strategic consequences. And I can't overstate enough how big the impact was for Pakistanis of knowing that the CIA had run a fake vaccination campaign in Pakistan. Not only did it increase anti-Americanism, it also heightened suspicions about international aid and charitable organizations operating in Pakistan, even though Save the Children denied being involved in the fake vaccination effort, even though it was accused of that. Fourth and finally, I would argue that Americans were deleteriously impacted by some of this. Some of the terrorists that emerged in South Asia post 9/11 targeted Americans, like the man trained by the Pakistani Taliban who tried to blow up Times Square, and also an attack on a CIA base in Afghanistan that had a Pakistani Taliban hand. And also the failure to get justice for Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal journalist who was beheaded by terrorists in Pakistan. This is linked in part to US post 9/11 policies. Pakistani prosecutors used false testimony to try to get convictions because they wanted to prove to the US that Pakistan was a strong partner in this counterterrorism alliance forged with the US after 9/11. And there's compelling evidence that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the 9/11 mastermind, personally executed Pearl, but the US chose not to try to prosecute him because it was afraid that it could undermine his prosecution for 9/11. So I'll end there.
Great. Let me just follow up with one quick one. What impact has the abrupt US and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan had on the region in terms of the fate of democracy, economic stability, and regional rivalries?
I think it's a bit too early to tell at this point. I do think that it may actually bring some benefits for economic stability and democracy in the longer term. The US, of course, had poured a lot of money into Afghanistan and into Pakistan too, with what proved to be a mistaken hope that US aid would confer leverage and get Pakistan to help the US achieve its goals in Afghanistan. But the US aid certainly produced some important infrastructural investments and development projects, but it also in Afghanistan fostered a deep dependence on foreign assistance, which of course remains to the present day. It also led to a lot of corruption and not all that much economic sustainability. As for the impact on democracy, the US has preferred to work with the Pakistani military over civilian leaders there on Afghanistan issues. It knows the military in Pakistan makes the big decisions on security and foreign policy. And so this helps advance US interest to an extent, but not necessarily civilian-led democracy in Pakistan. And I think with the US out of Afghanistan, it will still lean on the Pakistani military to an extent, likely in terms of trying to get counterterrorism support for Afghanistan, but not as much as had been the case when there were US boots on the ground in Afghanistan. And in terms of regional rivalries, Afghanistan's long been a battleground for India-Pakistan competition. And I think the US withdrawal will intensify this rivalry. Pakistan will seek to supplant Indian influence in Afghanistan. India had great relations with the non-Taliban governments in Afghanistan of the past. It was a major donor and friend to Kabul. Pakistan, by contrast, had been shut out, but now the roles are reversed with the Taliban in control in Afghanistan. I think that Pakistan will clearly seek to leverage its close ties to the Taliban to keep India out of Afghanistan, and that will further intensify the rivalry.
Thank you. So now we turn to Fernando. After 9/11, the West banded together in an unprecedented way to counter the jihadi threat in the largest military coalition ever formed for Operation Enduring Freedom. More than 120 countries participated in some way with the United States. Given the outcome, where does that leave the West today in dealing with jihadism and radicalization? What have we learned, or perhaps what haven't we learned? Unmute yourself. Unmute.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's a pleasure to be part of this very distinguished panel. Well, following what Professor Hoffman already said, if global jihadism is more extended, far more extended now than 20 years ago, if Al-Qaeda is now a global structure and not just a unitary organization based in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the global war on terror has been, generally speaking, a failure. And that failure has been observed, the consequences of that failure have been observed in all throughout the West. But speaking from Western Europe, where I am now, if we divide the past 20 years into two significant periods, the period between 2002 and 2011, and the period as from 2012, what we can see is that during the second period, the number of fatalities caused by jihadist terrorism is greater than in the first period. If we look at the second period, the level of radicalizations in the region are far greater than in the first period. Actually, over the past 10 years, we have experienced in Western Europe an unprecedented cycle of jihadist mobilization. If you just look at the number of individuals who became foreign terrorist fighters in Syria over the past 9-10 years, you will find that 1/5 of them were living in Europe, which means that Muslims aged 18 to 35 and living in Western Europe are more than 20 times overrepresented among foreign terrorist fighters, jihadist terrorist fighters, when compared with individuals coming from other regions in the war. So we still have to learn how to tackle the issue of radicalization. We haven't learned how to deal with the spread and the impact of jihadist ideologies. And this is perhaps the more acute problem that we are facing today. It is true that this cycle of jihadist mobilization in Europe, this unprecedented cycle of jihadist mobilization in Europe, has declined once the Islamic State organization has been deprived from the territorial control it enjoyed in Syria and Iraq. It is true also that the number of attacks throughout this period in Europe, foiled by the counterterrorism services, outnumbers the attacks actually executed. But we still have a lot to do when it comes, first of all, with tackling the issue of radicalization. We haven't really learned how to deal with that. And also we are still a long way to go, the West in general and Western Europe in particular, on properly cooperating and in particular in exchanging information on time so as to prevent terrorist attacks.
Thank you, Fernando. And now to Nadia. So you've long focused on the two most powerful forces in the Middle East. First, the quest for democratic reforms, as we saw in the Arab Spring, and second, the rise of political Islam. 2 decades after 9/11, what's the status of each of these trends in the Middle East?
Thank you, Robin. Allow me first to make a small correction. My two books are not yet published. They are in progress. So tune in, my updates will be on my website, but thank you for mentioning these two books. So, 20 years, 20 years, and before that, there was another 20, 30 years of investment, billions of dollars every single year to actually proselytize certain ideas, Wahhabism, Jihadi Salafism. When you invest billions of dollars to educate, I actually went to one of these schools, so I know exactly what they're taught. I'm surprised there's not more terrorism, in fact. So there's active investment, and this investment is supported by television stations, by mosques, etc. And there's not a counter investment in reform. There's not a counter investment in actually unleashing the soft power that the West has. All authoritarian regimes, be they Islamist, extremist, even China and Russia, they understand the threat of, if you would, democratic values and classical liberalism. So they go out of their way to prevent access to these ideas because they know they can undo extremism, they can undo authoritarianism. So they censorship is a means to an end of not allowing real competition of ideas. But yet, liberal democracies don't really lean on their strength. They're really yet to unleash their soft power. There's an aversion to actually going there, even though it's the most important front in some ways. I mean, the ideology has not really been challenged. It's yet to be challenged. So I think soft power needs to be the next episode. And we have a lot of allies all over the Muslim world, people at the grassroots levels. There's a lot of efforts that needs to be supported, but we need to actually put our weight behind these ideas the way we did in the Cold War, the way we discerned. We need to have something like Radio Free Europe. We need to have all sorts of soft power venues. And we're yet to do that really with jihadism.
Can I get back to my question though, and get your assessment? You kind of talked about unnamed groups that were engaged in propagating their ideologies through television and so forth. Give us a status report. What is the state of political Islam, of jihadism in the region 20 years after 9/11? That's the question. And then secondly, balance that off by explaining the state of the quest for political Islam. The Arab Spring, in many eyes, failed to achieve what it wanted. What is the status of efforts to continue that movement, revive it, re-energize it, or redirect it?
So what is the status of political Islam and the concept of Islamic State? In my opinion, this idea actually faces unprecedented challenge, even though on the face is a lot more jihadism, again, because there's an over investment in certain ideas. But it does face the greatest challenge because its very success is it's the beginning of its failure. When ISIS took over Iraq and Syria, nothing really furthered the idea that the Islamic State cannot solve the problem of unemployment, of all sorts of real issues that the Middle East is facing. So at the level of idea, I think it's weakened. Democratic efforts, yes, the Arab Spring has not really achieved its goals. However, this is more because there is no infrastructure, the building blocks of liberal democracies where everybody in the Arab world and Afghanistan, or a lot of people, want to migrate. The building blocks, the conceptual building blocks are not there. We have never had representative governments. We have never had laws that actually give equality to all citizens. These are not in our history. Today, with my PhD from Oxford, I cannot sign my own marriage contract in Jordan. I don't represent myself because I don't have agency. So these modern building blocks of liberal democracies that the Arab Spring, young people wanted to have, we actually need, again, the soft power, the educational systems to educate on human rights, human rights and building liberal democracies. So the war of ideas is still in full bloom. It is not over yet because the grievances are still there, have not been addressed. We still have in the Arab world #1 unemployment in the world. We still have phenomenal challenges. And unless there is real democratic means and everybody who actually has the merit to contribute is able to contribute, the unrest will continue.
Yes, it strikes me that in many ways, the Middle East is more messy. It has more failed or failing states than it did 20 years ago. And that by default, sometimes the Islamist groups of various different ilks, some working peacefully within systems, others trying to destroy it from outside, have prevailed, but again, by default, because there isn't much of an alternative. And as a result of the desire for stability, a lot of the autocratic regimes or autocratic leaders have prevailed. So again, I want to invite our audience, please, if you have questions, you can submit a question one of two ways, either by emailing MEP for Middle East Program, MEP@wilsoncenter.org, or tweet at Wilson Center MEP on Twitter, because we really would love to have your participation. So let's begin the second round and take a look at the future. Bruce, given your expertise, what is the future of jihadism, which is now, as you pointed out, a hydra rather than just a single group? These organizations have franchises that are a continent or an ocean away. How could it evolve down the road? What are the threats of the future?
I hate to say it, but we have to look to the past to see the future. And I wish that we had actually, I wish I could say that we had learned something from the history of the past 30 years, but I think we patently have not. We've seen this all before. In the 1990s, for example, foreign fighters gravitated from Afghanistan to new conflict zones in the Middle East and North Africa, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and brought with them violence and local that then became regional instability and then emerged, of course, as the global threat on 9/11. 2003, Iraq became a foreign fighter magnet. 2011, 2012, as a result of the Arab Spring, Syria, Libya, and other countries similarly attracted foreign fighters. 2014, Iraq, with the rise of ISIS. And of course, now we have 2021, where the United Nations already back in June had reported that some 8,000 to 10,000 foreign fighters were already converging on Afghanistan. So that's a process that's going to continue. It will result certainly in local instability and violence that will spread throughout the region. And that, if history is any signpost, will likely present serious international and global security problems. Let me add, just yesterday, the trial in Paris of the 15 terrorists responsible for the 2015 attacks that convulsed that city began. We have very short memories when it comes to terrorism, but if you recall, the conventional wisdom in 2014, 2015 was that ISIS was a local, not a global threat, and that even if it had the motivation, it didn't have the capability to carry out a major terrorist attack in Europe or elsewhere. Well, we see the falsity of that assumption, and that's what worries me gravely about the situation in Afghanistan today. We keep repeating as if it's a mantra or wishful thinking that somehow this over-the-horizon capability will magically deliver us from the threat of terrorism, whereas in the past, I think we've been remarkably successful with modest deployments of troops throughout the world, strengthening host country capabilities. So looking towards the future, this has been a tremendous boost to the narrative of the Salafi jihadist terrorist movement. Even Shia terrorist groups like Hezbollah praising the Taliban for its victory. It cannot but inspire imitation, emulation, and motivation to replicate the Taliban's success. After all, for these groups, this is a divinely ordained struggle. And as General Mattis famously said in 2013 when he was commander of Central Command, no war is over until the enemy says it's over. The enemy always gets a vote. And in this case, it's very clear from everything we're hearing from Afghanistan and elsewhere that our enemies have not laid down their arms and rather see what's happened in the past month as something that only enhances and breathes new life into their struggles, including that of, I would predict, of Al-Qaeda, who has been on the ropes in recent years. This is about the best possible news they could want, much like the invasion of Iraq in 2003 completely rejuvenated what had then been a debilitated, faltering movement.
Yeah, you bring up such important points. I remember I was on the front line both in Mosul in 2017 and down in Syria in 2019 as the two different parts of ISIS collapsed. And we celebrated the end of the caliphate. We've celebrated the demise of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, and Osama bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda leader. The United States has killed the last four emirs or leaders of ISIS Khorasan, and yet ISIS Khorasan was able to kill 13 American military personnel at Kabul airport, where there were 6,000 American troops in a very small space. So I wonder to what degree that these groups, that every time we take a military action, eliminate a leader, we inspire them even more, that there is more of a desire for revenge, and that we escalate by eliminating a leader, we escalate or reinvigorate or provide yet a new incentive to attack the United States and even recruit further afield.
Well, I would disagree only very slightly. I think eliminating, killing, or capturing terrorist leaders is absolutely essential. But as you've noted, in and of itself, that's not going to resolve this problem or defeat our enemy. And this is why what Nadia has just said is so enormously important, is that from the start of this struggle, President Bush had said this would be a war of ideas, but that's never been the case. You know, just as you're expressing, Robin, there are very clear metrics when you kill and capture terrorists. The metrics of having prevented someone from becoming an extremist or derailed them from a path to terrorism is something that's incalculable, but is nonetheless essential. And I would say that's been our problem, is we've relied overly on kinetic means and military force and neglected the other elements that have to be brought into play to counter these groups. And after 20 years, we still haven't understood that.
Absolutely agree. One last thing. 3 years ago, I was part of a study that brought together 20 terrorism experts, and Clint Watts, whom you know well, helped identify the patterns of the three different generations of jihadis, going back to the original group that fought against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. And one of the things they identified was that with each group, with each generation, it was recruited from further afield. The first round came largely from the Gulf, and the issue was getting the Soviet Union to leave Afghanistan, to get a foreign occupier out. That the second generation, it went further afield. It recruited from a wider array, with the birth of Al Qaeda, so forth, wider array of Arab countries. It had a more proactive, a bolder agenda, and it was recruited in half the time of the previous generation. And that the third generation went global, and its agenda went global as well. And so I'm wondering if there are, when we look at these patterns and we look at, okay, at the end of Afghanistan, does this begin a fourth generation? What that generation will look like? How might it be different? I mean, you know this subject so well.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head, is that the desire for revenge or retaliation looms ever larger than before, but now there's the prospects of actually achieving it. I think the Taliban's success and the regeneration of Al Qaeda, because we know how close, I mean, Al Qaeda and the Taliban are joined at the hip, and the Haqqani network is the bridge between the two, and the fact that Siraj Haqqani, someone on the FBI's list of the most wanted terrorists in the world, is now the acting interior minister, should not allay anyone about the Taliban's true intentions. So you've got now the motivation and potentially the means to achieve or to fulfill the motivations of vengeance and retaliation. And you're absolutely right. I mean, this is what catapulted ISIS to prominence, was its ability to stay one step ahead of all of us while we were still focused on terrorist recruitment and radicalization on the internet. They were already mining and exploiting social media, which in 2014, all of us completely underestimated and misunderstood. So for terrorists, this is what their entire survival is predicated on, this ability to seize and exploit new technologies to broadcast and publicize their aims and motivations. And as we saw with ISIS, to attract new recruits from far-flung places. I mean, no one should, I think, breathe a sigh of relief that the caliphate has been defeated and not also acknowledge that ISIS achieved almost the unthinkable, the aspiration that all terrorists had to recruit a global basis from somewhere between 120 to 140 different countries. I think there's 191 countries in the United Nations. I mean, almost every country in the world sent foreign fighters to ISIS. That was not a flash in the pan, because going back to my earlier point, we may be particularly bad at learning from history, but I can assure you the terrorists are very good. And they're looking back at history and trying to figure out ways that they can build on previous successes to ensure their longevity. And that's why I think they will build on the events of the past month to attract new recruits, to gain new supporters, and indeed to continue to marshal their resources to carry on the struggle.
Yes, they adapt better than we do. We don't have the flexibility or agility as they do. I think one of the interesting things about Al Qaeda today is that it's still very small. It was estimated to be about 400 after 9/11, and they're believed to be somewhere around 600, although the numbers may have increased with the releases from prisons after the Taliban swept through. But they were the elite force multipliers for the Taliban, actually far more sophisticated fighters. They provided intelligence, strategy. So, numbers often belie the reality of what the threat is or what the adversary has. So, Michael, let's turn to you. What are the security threats within the region and from the region you cover that should shape our thinking about the future? The US misread or misunderstood Afghanistan for 20 years. Even the senior military officials involved in designing strategy will confess. So, what should we understand to inform our decisions in the future, given the failures and the misunderstandings of the past?
Yeah, so I envision three main types of security threats. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means. One, I think the most serious one and the most immediate one is stepped up attacks by regional terror groups galvanized by the Taliban's victory. So just as the presence of US troops in Afghanistan generated new terrorist threats, the departure of US troops from Afghanistan will generate new terrorism threats. Militants in Afghanistan and beyond have really been galvanized by a rare occurrence. Their Taliban brothers in arms have seized control over an entire country even before the foreign troops they were seeking to expel have left. This is huge. And we know from history, and I think this was mentioned earlier to an extent, that the presence of US troops on the soil of Muslim countries has been a major grievance for many Islamist militant groups. Al-Qaeda was formed in great part because of bin Laden's anger at the presence of US forces on Saudi soil. So to see US forces leave and for the Taliban to seize control, it's intoxicating for militants in Afghanistan and in the broader region. So, the Pakistani Taliban will be inspired to carry out more attacks in Pakistan. And in fact, according to the latest data, it carried out 30 attacks in Pakistan in the month of August alone, which is the largest monthly figure since last year. And of course, it was in August when the Taliban took control. India-focused groups from Pakistan like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, they could be prompted to step up attacks in India-administered Kashmir. And they'll be further inspired by the Taliban's recent statement that it supports the plight of Muslims in Kashmir and that it will speak out on that. That's huge because earlier on, the Taliban tended to say that it prefers to stay out of the Kashmir dispute. So that's pretty significant. To a lesser extent, militants in Bangladesh, which has had problems with violent extremism in recent years, they could pose a danger in that country as well. The second security threat to watch out for, I think, is intra-militant competition that could play out violently. We saw recently how potent ISIS Khorasan remains in Afghanistan. ISIS-K is a rival of the Taliban's. It will likely try to prevent the Taliban from consolidating its power by stepping up attacks in Afghanistan. And this could spill into Pakistan, with ISIS-K trying to target Taliban or pro-Taliban actors based in Pakistan. The third security threat, which I actually would characterize as the least serious, at least in the immediate term, is the potential for long-range, externally focused terrorist attacks emanating from Afghanistan and the surrounding region. Certainly with the Taliban fully in control in Afghanistan, its Al-Qaeda ally will have more space and time to reconstitute itself and to gather strength. But Al Qaeda, at least as it exists in Afghanistan, has been degraded to a considerable degree, and it's really going to be starting from a pretty low base and would need a lot of time and help, which it could well get, to regain the capacity to carry out attacks far further afield, including in the U.S. homeland. And as for ISIS, clearly it has the capacity to carry out, or it has had the capacity to carry out major attacks in far-flung areas. But in Afghanistan, the ISIS-K faces a number of challenges. One is a challenge posed by the reality of its Taliban rival, which of course is now in control, as well as rivalries with most militant groups in Afghanistan and the broader region, because they're mostly allied with Al Qaeda, which is not ISIS's friend. ISIS-K could certainly find some local partners to work with in Afghanistan, as it has in the past. This can help it carry out attacks in Afghanistan, perhaps some over the border and other countries in the region, but not necessarily outside of Afghanistan. So I think it's important to distinguish between, on the one hand, terrorism threats emanating from Afghanistan and the region that can directly impact and inflict damage on Afghanistan and the broader region, and on the other hand, terrorist threats emanating from Afghanistan and the region that can directly impact areas further afield, such as Europe and the US. I think that the first category of threat is clear and present, but the latter one is, at least at this point, less sharp.
That's fascinating. The General Milley said just last week that when he looked at the future of Afghanistan, he saw the possibility of a civil war. How does that play out? Is that just ISIS versus Taliban and its Al Qaeda allies? Especially given the fact that the new version of the Northern Alliance, the Northern Resistance Front, has basically been pushed out of the Panjshir Valley, that there's not a kind of third player. So how do you see a civil war playing out, and between whom?
Yeah, I think that Milley could have been referring to the possibility of this violent competition playing out between the Taliban and ISIS-K and other rivals for sure. But I think that one could also look at the political realities of Afghanistan moving forward, that the Taliban is going to have a lot of control consolidating its power, certainly in great part because ISIS will try to undermine it. But also, you're going to have a Taliban group that's going to struggle to bring a very severe economic crisis under control. This is not a group that has any experience with governance other than the types of horrible things it did back in the 90s, and of course leading up to the present day with using these draconian forms of justice and so on. And so I think it'll be difficult for the Taliban to gain legitimacy, and that could in time induce resistance to Taliban rule, which could certainly become violence. That can embolden and strengthen existing resistance movements, including what's left of what you have in the Panjshir right now. So I think that certainly you could look at this prospect of a civil war from the lens of rivalries and battles between different terror groups, but also just looking at the political situation. The Taliban's struggle to consolidate its power could lead to resistance that could well be nonviolent. And of course, there's been plenty of nonviolent resistance, so to speak, just in the last few days with these people protesting in Kabul, including many women. But if things get to a more advanced point, that's when you could look to the possibility of wider, more organized forms of armed resistance, and that could conceivably lead to a civil war.
So just one last thing. A lot of people may not understand the difference between ISIS-K and the Taliban. Can you explain it?
Yeah, I mean, they're very different. ISIS-K is mainly comprised of Pakistani and Afghan fighters who had essentially split off from the Afghan and Pakistani Talibans in recent years, mainly disaffected members of the two different Talibans. But they're rivals because ISIS-K is a formal part of the parent ISIS. Back when ISIS-K first emerged in, I believe, 2015 in Afghanistan, its presence in Afghanistan was formally announced by ISIS Central. And there's a fair amount of evidence that scholars have uncovered that ISIS Central, so to speak, has provided a fair amount of support, financial support, military support, and so on to ISIS-K in Afghanistan. And so they are rivals. They have literally been fighting each other. The Taliban in recent years has been going to war, so to speak, against ISIS fighters in Afghanistan. And they are separate. They are rivals. And I think people sometimes get confused by the fact that you do have many former Taliban, including former Haqqani network fighters, going over to ISIS-K That, I think, makes some people believe that there's some sort of linkage between the Haqqanis, the broader Taliban, and ISIS-K, but that's not the case. They're two distinct organizations.
So I think one of the important differences is to understand that bin Laden actually deferred on creating a caliphate. He said you had to convert the population, win them over, and then when you had a consensus, then you could create a caliphate. Whereas ISIS has tactically and strategically said, let's form a caliphate, be damned what people care, and force them to accept us, convert them forcibly. So this, again, it's always a fascinating contrast between the two movements. So let's go to Fernando. The big question, don't forget to unmute yourself. Fernando. Looking ahead, what's next for the West in dealing with jihadism, both the future threats and future policy responses? Are there any new ideas out there, any new approaches for the future that have emerged from the failures of the past? What can the West do? You're in Europe, maybe you want to take a look at what Europe can offer. It would be more effective than what we've tried in the past.
Thank you very much, Robin. Before I answer your question, please allow me to make a quick precision. Seems to me that the official narrative in the US is that of speaking about Al-Qaeda has been degraded. It's no more than a few hundred individuals. But I'm talking to you from Southern Europe. What is that supposed to mean when we see thousands of Al-Qaeda members active in the Maghreb and the Sahel and Western Africa, with the GNIM in contact with Al-Qaeda Central, with the Al-Shabaab, which is an official branch of Al-Qaeda, in contact with the General Command of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, Afghanistan. So I do think that the idea of Al-Qaeda has been degraded is misleading. It's confusing us. No, Al-Qaeda is greater than what it was on 9/11. It's just that it is now a global decentralized entity. And the Abbottabad papers made it clear to us that when leaders of territorial branches want to do something beyond the usual operational autonomy they have, they make consultations with Al-Qaeda Central. So Al-Qaeda has not been degraded. Al-Qaeda Central now, the Central Command, is smaller than what Al-Qaeda as a unitary organization used to be in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but only because we have now all these global decentralized structures. So that's an important issue, in my opinion, to take it into account. Even more when over the past, since 2013, Al-Qaeda decided to prioritize spending and establishing and consolidating influence in different areas across the Arab world before retaking the idea of attacking the West in the West. So they refrain from provoking the West to be able to better do what they found priority over the past decade. And on the other issue about revenge, again, moving out of the usual US eyes, revenge. That revenge is critical when talking about the jihadist threat, and not just about occupation, When they blame the West and Western, they speak about occupation, but they also speak about prisoners, right? You know, the major attack in the West after 9/11 took place in Madrid, right? And the individuals who established the network in Madrid as from March 2002 were the individuals whom the police were not able to arrest when the major blow to Al-Qaeda in Western Europe was conducted by the Spanish police on November 2001, after the evidence came about the close relationship between Mohammed Atta's Hamburg cell and Abu Dada's cell in Madrid, right? So revenge was what motivated the Madrid bombers, although the attacks took place also at a moment when, in the context of the Iraq War, the general strategy of Al-Qaeda facilitated things, and actually there was a connection with Al-Qaeda's External Operation Command. Now, going back to your question, obviously, the success of the Taliban in Afghanistan, which I will rephrase as the success of the Taliban in collaboration with Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda related entities in Afghanistan, there's no doubt that it's already having an impact that will benefit the sector of global jihadism aligned with Al-Qaeda. Actually, the success narrative among jihadists already started before. Not when they took Kabul, but when the Taliban forced the American administration to sit on a negotiating table in a country promoting Islamism worldwide. The Taliban were, under the close scrutiny of the United Nations counterterrorism agencies, and at the same time that they were talking to the U.S. administration, the United Nations monitoring team was notifying that the Taliban were not living up to the alleged agreements that they had reached over the negotiating table. So this is not a real surprise what happened. I think that it is particularly a risky contest for the West in general, because we have this rivalry between Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. So it is not hard to imagine that both entities will be interested in perpetrating a major attack in the West. And for that matter, the more likely scenario is Western Europe. It's closest, it's more permeable, and probably counterterrorism abilities are not up to the needs. Having said so, there's another reason why the West, or why Western Europe in particular will become, as it has already been so over the past 20 years, will still be even more the main scenario for jihadist attacks in the West in general.
So, Fernando, can I interrupt just for 1 second and ask you, we need to move on, but I'm very curious what you think. Does Europe still look at the United States as the place to lead the Western response to jihadism? Does the United States still have the same kind of credibility it might have had before 9/11, before the Iraq War?
All right. Well, this very panel is an example of what Europeans are afraid of. We are dealing with the impact of 9/11, but it seems like only the US had soldiers in Afghanistan or in other areas in the world. Well, the Europeans also have soldiers there. It looks at this only one way of approaching and viewing things, that is the US approach. And certainly, when concerning the Afghanistan issue, the Europeans went into Afghanistan out of solidarity with the US post 9/11. And you can think how Europeans could now feel about the US taking decisions without proper consultations. And obviously, this is going to damage, at least in the short term, the transatlantic counterterrorism cooperation, trust in the counterterrorism cooperation between one and the other side of the Atlantic. Of course, it's going to have consequences. And the Europeans are already thinking about promoting their approach, which is less prone to military missions lasting long period. The French are already learning about this in and around Mali nowadays. So you will expect Europeans to move away from the US-led on counterterrorism.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question, there are two ways to do it. You can email MEP for Middle East Program, MEP@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet @WilsonCenterMEP. So let's go to our first question, which is a follow-up for Nadia on what she mentioned the first time about soft power. The question is, what would a Western soft power offensive look like? And how could the results be measured? How could secular and civil liberal movements in the Middle East and North Africa connect with soft power of the West?
All right. So, great question. Let me start with saying that when we go into soft power, we have to address it as a serious war, even though it's a soft war. But it is serious because in recruiting for global jihadism, there really is an art to it as far as jihadis go. There are master narratives that recruiters use, master narratives that appeal to Muslims no matter where they are. And they address grievances that are not just economic, because if economics was the only grievance, we wouldn't have bin Laden. He's a very wealthy individual. But even grievances related to identity in the world. Religious identity, religious, what is it? Sorry, sometimes my brain goes to Arabic. So basically, our role in the world as the Muslim world. So there are a lot of grievances, there are master narratives that are being used. So what will a soft power onslaught look like? First of all, it has to go straight to these master narratives and challenge them at multiple fronts. And that has a lot of different ways. There's not just one size fits all. We have, for example, incredibly powerful on the ground, local grassroots actors that need to be empowered, that need to be amplified, that need to remember that Islamists had a lot of amplification. Their message didn't win on its own merits. They actually had a lot of support. You know, when I look at a lot of the most watched videos, YouTube videos, that actually take on jihadism, why is it, for example, that a lot of these people that take on and discredit jihadi narratives are being shut down and jailed by dictators? These are our greatest counter-narrative producers. These are people from within the culture that understand the history, the religion, the sensitivities, and work from within these narratives. They are our best shot at taking on this debate one-on-one, and they're being silenced. So we need to protect them. We need to amplify their voices.
Can I interrupt you for a minute? Because we throw around words like empowered. They need to be empowered. I don't know what that means. You know, the United States has tried, whether it's its public diplomacy programs. It's tried creating its own television stations to reach out to the Middle East, to give an alternative view from state-sponsored television. Can you be very specific when you say these groups need to be empowered? Are you talking about financial aid, which crosses a threshold that gets into some dicey, are you supporting only those who speak English, went to Western universities, look like us, etc.? And are these guys ultimately not really democratic forces? So to help an audience understand, what do you mean by, what specifically does empowered mean?
So first of all, I think there's a little bit of sensitivity in the West to actually empower those who are Western educated. What's wrong with that? Like, what's wrong with educated people like Malala? Should we empower, the older generation? So I want to stay away from basically, I think we are so imbued in our like freedom to believe whatever we want, in those of us who live in Western countries, freedom to express ourselves, that we take it for granted that everybody should be free to express themselves and we shouldn't, quote unquote, impose Western values. But it's not about actually imposing Western values. It's about creating access to things like sharing power. The reason why it is inevitable there would be civil war among these jihadi, as there always has been, is because there's no concept of sharing power. There's no concept of, and they've already, like a lot of these groups in Iraq, for example, killed a lot of their mutual senior leadership because they don't have these concepts. So what does it look like specifically? You mentioned the television. Yes, we did support a television network. I actually wrote a column for it, but we didn't really, we are not studying very well how to use this platform. We're not giving this platform to those who can educate different audiences on how to actually go about building the infrastructure of civil society, of democratic values. We wanted, when we had Al-Hurra, to compete with Al Jazeera and put on Hamas and put on Hezbollah and put on people who already have way oversized platform. So because we're not yet taking this soft power seriously, we pay lip service, but we haven't actually put our weight behind it. Is it a loss that 40% of Afghani women have gone to school? I mean, that is 40%. And the war is not over yet. Like Michael said, I mean, the descent will come, but it will take a while. And the aid has to be financial, it has to be logistic, it has to be, we have the phenomenal platform, the online, everybody has their cell phone. So there's multiple ways and we have to use all of them, not just one.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you at some point.
Yes,
we don't have time for it now, but I hope that you write something and address specifically what's needed, because there's just all these generalities. And I think the United States has tried over and over in 20 years to create programs that address some of these soft power issues. I mean, we can only go so far in supporting civil society groups, and sometimes we taint them when we engage with them. It gives ammunition to the government in power to say, oh, they're American stooges or they're CIA, flunkies or whatever. So this is where I think we in the United States, I agree with you, should be using soft power. The question is how. So I challenge you at some point to educate.
That is my second book. That is the book I am actually working on in the Wilson Center, A Million Clicks to Freedom. And you mentioned we change them by connecting with them. Sometimes all we need to do is make sure that these regimes don't lock them up so they can still have a voice. So, but yeah.
Yeah, good luck with that. We still have some of our own citizens locked up in places we can't get out. So
That's
Bruce,
true.
let me go back to you. There's a very, very good question about why is it that some extremist movements eventually burn out or fail? I know that there are some statistics on it. I remember using them years ago, that only, I think, a certain percentage of them actually survive longer than 5 years, and the majority of them end up flaming out. And this is extremist movements kind of worldwide. But give us some sense of how they fail and what it might take to actually nudge the process along.
Well, I think it's true that probably in the aggregate, most terrorist groups, or at least historically during the Cold War, 95% did not last more than 5 years. In fact, 95% didn't last more than a year. and almost half that number didn't last more than 5 years. But that's the wrong way to look at it. It goes back to your point about, Al-Qaeda Central may be small, but it has this enormous force multiplying potential. And the problem here is that that infinitesimal percentage that survives for decades and is therefore becomes increasingly more difficult to eliminate. I mean, think about it. Hezbollah was founded in 1982. It's almost 40 years old. It shows no signs of disappearing. Hamas was founded in 1987. Similarly, has no signs of disappearing. Al-Qaeda was founded in 1988 and has constantly regenerated and reinvented itself. So I would say I care less about the groups that have disappeared and been eliminated. They're in this Darwinian process, are the weak ones. They don't have charismatic leadership. They can't promote a narrative that continues to resonate and to attract new recruits and supporters. And that it's precisely, unfortunately, the stronger groups like Al-Qaeda, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, that present the most formidable national and international security problems because of their longevity and because of their resilience. And, in a lot of this discussion, I've thought, well, every president since the war on terror began has declared the defeat of Al-Qaeda. And it's often been precipitous. And unfortunately, these groups are in the business of survival. And I would say, unfortunately, in recent weeks, their survivability has only been enhanced, not decreased. So rather than look at the entire universe of terrorist groups, indeed, most of them do fail. The ones that matter are unfortunately the ones that last longest.
So let me follow up on that, because I was actually living in Lebanon when Hezbollah emerged. Remember it very well. I'm one of the few Westerners who ever met Imad Mughniyeh. I've interviewed Hassan Nasrallah and Naim Qassem. The one thing that's very striking is that the groups that succeed seem to become more sophisticated. They become political entities. They become economic powerhouses. Hezbollah has survived largely because it provides the services that the state didn't in Lebanon, or hasn't, or provided only for elite few or certain sects in a multi-sectarian society. At the same time, Al-Qaeda, which has also survived, doesn't do any of that. ISIS tried when it was part of the caliphate, and in the end was defeated militarily and is back to being, an insurgency. So how important is it? And what are the, when you look at the future of this phenomena, what does it take for what we consider a terrorist group, or the United States designates officially sanctions a terrorist group, to help them survive? And what are the dangers to us? I mean, Lebanon was the most westernized of all the Arab societies, and Hezbollah has changed that, made it much more complicated to ensure the survival of that state.
Well, impatience certainly is our worst enemy, and we're remarkably impatient. It's, as the Taliban used to say, we may have the watches, but they have the time, and they indeed have proved that. And that's part of the problem. I would say that Al-Qaeda has definitely, under al-Zawahiri, moved much more into empowering its local franchises to engage in acts of governance and also building their own version of a civic society. One of the jihadis' main arguments is that they're not corrupt. I mean, they are, of course, but they at least portray it that they don't have quite the venality that many local potentates, for instance, have in embracing Western aid and siphoning it off. But nonetheless, Al-Qaeda under bin Laden was much more cautious about empowering its local franchises to engage in self-governance. I think al-Zawahiri very wisely, because of the competition from ISIS in particular, has pursued that route. That said, we have to remember when U.S. forces took down Al-Qaeda's headquarters in Kandahar in November 2001, they found that bin Laden had a very well-stocked library. And amongst the books he had were books on Menachem Begin and the Irgun struggle against the British in pre-state Israel. And what he wanted to know is not terrorist tips, even though the Irgun, of course, had blown up the King David Hotel, but rather he was studying, we know this from multiple sources, that he was studying the Irgun's transition from a terrorist group to a political party, to Herut, the Freedom Party. So even groups like Al-Qaeda aspire to precisely the transition that Hezbollah has achieved, and that inspires them. Now, it may take them forever, and it may never happen, but I go back to an earlier point I made. if these struggles are divinely ordained, you just don't give up. And as you pointed out, there are successive generations that the torch is passed to.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think looking forward, we again make the mistake sometimes of thinking them as just terrorist groups or extremist movements, when in fact they actually have ambitions to provide. And one of the reasons, I remember wandering through during the days of the last Taliban rule in the 1990s, wandering through the poppy fields around Jalalabad, and these guys were selling to whatever the relationship was, the middlemen who had clearance from the Taliban, and producing the largest source of heroin around the world, and that was during Taliban rule. Let's go from that point to Michael and a related issue. So, how do you think the Taliban will govern? Have they learned from their past experience? Are they under enough pressure going forward that they have to accommodate whether it's the economic challenges in Afghanistan, the drought and the hunger that is widespread? Do you think they will become more pragmatic, or do you think that both in dealing with kind of their domestic challenges, but also in how they deal with those who flock to Afghanistan now as a safe haven for extremist operations, potentially in the region or around the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I really don't think that the Taliban has changed in a big way at all in terms of its worldview, its outlook, its basic ideology. That hasn't changed. And also what hasn't changed is its willingness to use violence. I mean, we've seen over the last few days that it's been beating women in the streets of Kabul. It's been beating journalists. It's been doing all kinds of terrible things, just as it always has. I think where it has changed is that it recognizes the importance of PR. And I think this is why you've had these narratives coming from the Taliban over the last few years that suggest that it's a softer, more moderate version of its previous self. Now, and another thing that has changed, I think, is that it does recognize the importance of legitimacy. The Taliban did gain a measure of legitimacy when it signed that agreement with the US government last year. And I think it wants to maintain that just because it recognizes that legitimacy entails theoretically assistance, foreign assistance. I think if there's one thing that the Taliban is looking for the world is it's looking for financial support. And for the reasons that you mentioned, there's a severe economic crisis that's multifaceted. The US and the West have essentially cut off access to about $10 billion in foreign reserves to the Taliban government, and they're in a tough spot. But I think what the Taliban is banking on is not necessarily to expect recognition from the US and other countries in the West that would look for assurances from the Taliban that the Taliban is not willing to provide, such as an inclusive government. We know that this government that's announced is not inclusive at all. Also in terms of assurances on human rights, things like that, the Taliban is not going to provide that. But I think the Taliban is banking on the hope that there will be other countries, particularly countries in the region like China and Russia and Pakistan, maybe Turkey and some of the countries in the Gulf, that would have a much lower bar for what they would be looking for before being willing to recognize the Taliban government. They would only be looking for some degree of security assurances, particularly in terms of counterterrorism. And after that, I think that the suggestion is that some of these groups would be willing to recognize and in time provide financial support to the Taliban. And I think in this regard, China is a real key player. It's a capital-rich country which has the capacity to provide assistance if it decides it's in its interest to do that with the Taliban. And I think that it would. But no, I don't. So the Taliban has become more pragmatic only in the sense that it recognizes that there's certain things that it has to do, such as try to project its counterterrorism bona fides by ensuring that it's going to continue to go after ISIS-K. It may also choose to go after some small, relatively insignificant groups that don't really provide benefits to the Taliban, like ETIM, a group mainly comprised of Uyghur militants that's done a lot more damage in Syria than it has done in Afghanistan. It's a group that worries China, though. And I think there's where the Taliban can say, well, look, we're not going to provide space to this group, with the hope that that would lead to better relations with China and financial assistance.
Yeah, a couple of points. I think 75% of the Afghan budget came from the West. I think maybe even just the United States. And you consider we actually paid the salaries of the entire Afghan military, and all these people now will be without funds. in terms of the government, I think it's very striking that at least 4 of the members of government who've been named are graduates of Guantanamo Bay. And you have to wonder what that does in terms of shaping its outlook on the United States, or what it does. One of the big questions, I think, for the United States is going to be, do we help the Afghan people as we say we do, but in ways that will help the Taliban continue to rule, because the questions of the economic questions are one way or another addressed through international NGOs. I think one of the big questions going forward will be, can the Taliban speak with one voice? This is a deeply fragmented movement, as so many of them are. They have different tactics, they have different styles, they have different leaders among the factions. And of course, I wonder how long it holds together. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to look at. So Fernando, let's turn to you for a minute. Don't forget to unmute. And one of the questions being asked of you is, be specific. What would an effective response look like from the West? We've blown it in the past. Nothing has worked terribly well. Can you outline, one of the questioners asked, what the key elements of an effective strategy to counter radicalization? And that's, of course, the first step to joining a militant group. It is that radicalization, the alienation, marginalization. What is the most effective set of actions that the West could take? Unmute.
In my opinion, there are two most important initiatives to follow in this respect. One of them is to fight, to counter the propaganda coming from extremist organizations, jihadist organizations in this case, because what we see in the West is that individuals who became open to the jihadist ideas, mostly young Muslims in the West who became open to jihadist ideas, do so because they are suffering from an identity crisis, out of personal issues, personal problems, or because they had been successfully reached by the propaganda of these entities. So I will focus the radicalization prevention programs and plans, on the one hand, on countering the propaganda coming from jihadist organizations, and on the other hand, to assess the accommodation of second-generation Muslims in our societies. We have to keep in mind the most jihadists in the West, or coming out of the West, are second-generation Muslims, descendant of first-generation immigrants coming from predominantly Muslim societies. So to facilitate the proper accommodation of this individual, which is something that is not limited to socioeconomic integration. It has to do with values, with culture. And in this particular respect, the West in general is not conscious enough of the need to address the influence of Islamist movements, and in particular Salafist congregations and preachers and influences, because all those influences tend to self-segregate communities, and that facilitates the work of the jihadist organizations promoting in their own propaganda. So I will focus on those two things, the propaganda and the proper accommodation of second-generation Muslims in the West.
So Fernando, I'm going to challenge you to also, after this session, do something that explains what propaganda you use. I know that the administrations in the past have all tried, setting up their rapid response teams and so forth. And I think it would be very helpful to hear from you about exactly what to do. But we don't have time for that. I have one question to ask each of you to wrap this up. We have 6 minutes, 7 at most. So I'm going to go in reverse this time and begin with Nadia. We have a question from Rob Litvak, who's the vice president of the Wilson Center and one of the most thoughtful scholars on a whole range of issues. So Rob asks a very timely question. 20 years ago, before 9/11, the National Security Council's senior director for terrorism, Richard Clarke, told George W. Bush, the system is blinking red. As we approach the anniversary here, in terms of the possibility of an attack on the homeland or the same kind of dangers going forward in some form, is the system still blinking red? So I'm going to begin with Nadia and with Bruce. So Nadia, take it away. You're muted.
May I just clarify, when you say the system, do you mean the system in the Muslim world or in the West, or what exactly?
The direct quote was, the system is blinking red. In other words, there were enough dangers that were visible. Take it.
Oh, I actually think it is more dangerous than ever, because the ideological war is not just between terrorism and liberal democracies, it's between authoritarianism in general, represented in China and Russia. And these people invest in their own ideologies, invest in preventing good ideas from reaching people. And we're not investing yet, again, in as much as we should in the counter narrative. You mentioned that we cannot keep dictators from locking up the right influencers. There's a lot of them who actually run away to the West. There's a lot of them in the West who would love to they are shameless about who they get money from or who they get employment from, because they want to reach people who, again, they want to know how to build really democratic values, democratic norms, sharing power, all the things to address the grievances, not just economic, but also even in identity in a global system where there is national pride still in these communities. How do we see ourselves with pride, that we contribute to humanity? So I'll stop there.
Great. Fernando, you're next. Unmute yourself, Fernando. You're next. To answer the same question. Answer the same question. You can't hear? Okay, so we'll move to Michael. Michael, can you answer the same question? As we approach the anniversary, in terms of the possibility of an attack on the homeland or something equivalent, is the system still blinking red?
Yes, absolutely. And looking at this in a South Asian context, it's definitely, the system is still blinking red, very red. Just to replicate or reiterate one of the main themes of this discussion, it's so true in South Asia that it's easy to kill terrorists, right? But it's so much harder to kill the extremist ideologies that sustain and radicalize terrorists. And that's clearly the case in South Asia. Pakistan continues, it's still an epicenter for extremist ideologies. You have these ideologies of hate that are very present there in terms and manifested in textbooks and public schools, in even things that you hear on TV sometimes by certain personalities, religious leaders, some religious leaders spout some really nasty stuff. And what we've seen over the last few years is the emergence of new political parties in Afghanistan that have this, in Pakistan, that have the same nasty, bigoted ideologies that terrorists do. And so that's an indication of possible mainstreaming of these extremist ideologies. And I think that it goes further. We talk about Islamist militancy and the ideologies that animate Islamist militants. But you look at a country like India, which is going through what I would describe as a very difficult time, where you have these ideologies of hate driven by Hindu nationalism and Hindutva. It's a very different type of thing from what we've been talking about, but that certainly is concerning as well. But in terms of what threatens the United States, I go back to what I said before. I don't think at this point that we should think that there are threats in Afghanistan or in South Asia that could morph into terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland. I don't think that's a concern, but I definitely think that the incidence and the prevalence of terrorist organizations and extremist ideologies in Afghanistan and the broader region remains very strong, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
Thank you. And last and never least, Bruce, take it away. What's your answer?
What a brilliant final question. But I would say it's not blinking red, it's flashing red with sirens blaring. I say that because 20 years ago, the United States was at the apogee of its power. We were the undisputed lone superpower in the world. We weren't faced with competition from China, from an aggressive Russia, from profound climate change, from a terrible pandemic. And not least, we really didn't face the threat of domestic terrorism. Today, we are preoccupied and distracted on so many different levels with so many traditional and non-traditional national security concerns. This is precisely the environment that terrorists seek to take advantage of. When we're preoccupied and distracted, whether it's true or not, or whether it will be proven, but nonetheless, terrorists have the hubris to believe that they can sneak underneath the radar and carry out a significant attack. And here, I think Fernando was absolutely right earlier. The main threat of another 2004 Madrid attack or 7705 London transport attack, or attack on the Manchester Arena when Ariana Grande was performing in 2017, looms large as well.
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, I have to agree, and I think that we may see another 20 years, just like we've seen the last 20 years, in trying to contain, counter, diffuse, defang extremist movements, not just in the Islamic world, but some of them at home too. So listen, this has been a spectacular panel at a very historic moment. I can't thank enough our speakers. You've just each one contributed so very, very much. Bruce Hoffman, my dear, very old friend now. Michael Kugelman, my colleague at the Wilson Center. Fernando, great to meet you. And thank you, Nadia. It really was a wonderful, wonderful event. I'm sorry that it comes on this sad anniversary, but I think we learned a lot. I think you provided a lot for all of us to think about. And I look forward to talking to you kind of hopefully about something else sometime down the road. Thank you all for joining us. Goodbye from the Wilson Center.